Imagine waking in the damp chill of a 14th century morning. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with rain, and the air carries the faint odor of smoke, horses, and mud. You rise, preparing to make your way into the heart of a bustling medieval town. But before you leave your wooden home or cramped room above a shop, you must slip your feet into something that marks not just your class, but your very place in the world. Your shoes. In medieval Europe, shoes were never just shoes. They were symbols of vanity, wealth, and sometimes silent instruments of suffering. Today, we might think of them as humble necessities, a barrier between skin and stone. But centuries ago, the wrong choice of footwear could deform bones, spread disease, and even hinder the way entire communities walked through their world. By the late 14th century, a strange trend had taken hold across much of Europe, known as poulains or krakows, depending on the region. These shoes extended far beyond the natural curve of the toes, curling or tapering to a dramatic, elongated point. Some were so long that their tips had to be tied up with chains to the wearer's knees so they wouldn't drag in the mud. Why? For the same reason many fashions throughout history spread like wildfire: vanity, social signaling, and the desire to be noticed. The longer the point, the higher your status. Nobles, dukes, and wealthy merchants competed with one another in displays of absurd footwear, while ordinary craftsmen attempted smaller imitations to show they too were not entirely of the lower ranks. But beneath the visual flair lay something far more troubling. These shoes were often destructive to the human foot. Modern podiatrists, looking back at skeletal remains from this era, have found hallux valgus, or bunions, rampant in the bones of medieval Europeans. The sharp tapering of poulains forced toes together, unnaturally distorting joints and placing relentless pressure on bones. The condition wasn't just cosmetic. It caused chronic pain and could permanently alter someone's gait. Archaeological digs in Cambridge and London reveal skeletons of townsfolk whose feet show severe deformities, often more pronounced in older adults, suggesting decades of suffering from fashionable shoes. And this was not limited to elites. Even those of modest means, wishing to mimic their betters, squeezed themselves into smaller, pointed designs. The irony is almost cruel. The very tool meant to carry people through their daily lives was silently crippling them. Of course, the church could not stay silent on such matters. Preachers railed against poulains as symbols of vanity and sin, linking the absurd points to moral decay. Some sermons described the shoes as devilish talons, designed to mock God's natural creation. In 1463, King Edward IV of England attempted to regulate footwear by law, forbidding anyone below the rank of lord to wear points longer than 2 inches. It was a small but telling attempt to curb not only fashion but also social ambition. In essence, shoes became a battlefield where status, morality, and health collided. Yet the laws did little to stop the trend. People continued to wear them because, as every age shows, when fashion speaks, practicality is often silenced. Imagine trudging through a medieval street in poulains. The ground is uneven, filled with mud, dung, and discarded refuse. The shoes are made of soft leather, offering little protection from sharp stones or icy puddles. The exaggerated points make walking awkward, forcing wearers into a careful, almost mincing gait. Now imagine doing this day after day, year after year. Whether you were a merchant standing for hours in a market stall, or a young squire pacing through castle corridors, your feet bore the brunt of fashion's cruelty. And yet, these shoes were more than just pain. They were social passports, silent declarations of belonging. To remove them, to step back into broader, simpler footwear, was to risk ridicule or invisibility. One of the most fascinating insights into this quiet suffering comes not from written chronicles, but from the earth itself. In cemeteries across medieval Europe, archaeologists have unearthed graves where the skeletons tell a quiet, stubborn truth. In a Cambridge graveyard, a man in his 50s revealed feet so misshapen by bunions that walking would have been painful every single day of his later life. Yet he lived, worked, and likely wore poulaines until his death. He was no nobleman. His grave goods suggest modest means, but he carried the scars of fashion like a badge across London. Similar remains show bunions not as rare afflictions, but as common deformities, silent echoes of a society where shoes dictated both comfort and class. By the late 15th century, the fashion began to wane. Shoes shifted to broader, flatter designs, and the most extreme points faded into memory. But the damage remained. Generations had lived with deformed feet, their lives subtly shaped by choices of vanity. What is most striking, when you think about it, is how quietly destructive these shoes were. They did not kill outright. They did not cause riots or wars. Instead, they eroded daily life step by step, making the simple act of walking a struggle for countless people. And yet, almost no chronicler thought to mention it, leaving the bones themselves as the only record of this widespread suffering. And so, as you picture the cobbled streets of medieval towns, crowded with men and women hobbling on pointed shoes, you might ask, what does it say about us? That even pain could not stop people from following fashion. Because if shoes could quietly cripple a continent, what else in medieval life, equally dull, equally ordinary, might have carried hidden consequences? If you stood in the heart of a medieval market, the sound would overwhelm you first. Hawkers shouting over each other, the ring of iron against anvils, the clatter of wooden carts. But walk past the stalls of meat, grain, or wool, and you would eventually arrive at a booth with rows of leather goods, belts, gloves, and, most importantly, shoes. Here, amid the smell of tanned hides and oily polish, you could glimpse one of the great undercurrents of European life, the way footwear became an economy of its own. Shoes in medieval Europe were almost always leather, stitched by hand and shaped over wooden lasts. This made them durable, but not indestructible. The poulaines, with their elongated, flimsy tips, wore down quickly, especially on the filthy streets. This constant wear meant shoes had to be purchased often, a quiet but steady drain on every household's resources. For wealthier townsfolk, this was simply another expense in the grand pageant of status. For peasants or poorer craftsmen, however, the cycle of wearing through shoes was a burden. Many could afford only one pair at a time, patched again and again until the leather was more stitched than hide. And yet, even the poor aspired to have points. Cobblers, sensing demand, offered cheaper, shorter peelings, so even laborers could hobble awkwardly along in fashion's shadow. It was, in many ways, a medieval echo of what you might call the fast fashion problem today, people sacrificing comfort, longevity for the illusion of keeping up. Shoes were not just goods to be sold, they were an easy target for taxation. Municipal records from cities like Paris and London list levies on shoemakers, guild fees, and import duties on fine leather. Governments knew that shoes were essential, yet aspirational, which made them perfect for raising revenue. The poulain's craze in particular became a windfall for cobblers and merchants. Imported leathers from Spain or North Africa were prized, and those materials carried tariffs. Every long-toed shoe that hit the street represented a ripple of money through tanners, traders, and rulers' coffers. It is no exaggeration to say that by the mid-15th century, Europe was walking uncomfortably on an entire economy of feet. You must understand the shoemakers' guilds. These were tightly controlled organizations that set prices, regulated apprenticeships, and maintained quality standards. A master cobbler did not simply decide to make poulains on a whim. His guild determined how far fashion could stretch. Guild records from London, for instance, reveal fines against cobblers who tried to cut corners with cheap stitching or inferior hides. But they also show how guilds thrived on the poulain craze. The longer the point, the more leather required, and the higher the profit. Every ridiculous shoe was not just a fashion statement, it was a statement of guild power at first glance. Shoes might seem irrelevant to warfare, but think of an army marching hundreds of miles across fields and rivers, their only barrier against mud and frost being the leather around their feet. Now imagine those shoes are poulains. The long tips were impractical for soldiers, who needed sturdy, broad footwear for speed and balance. Chroniclers note that while nobles sometimes insisted on wearing them to display rank, they were quickly abandoned on campaign. For common foot soldiers, practicality prevailed, boots or turn shoes without points. Still, the fashion's dominance in civilian life meant shoemakers prioritized poulains. Armies often faced shortages of sturdy boots because cobblers were too busy supplying the urban elite with fashionable points. In a small but very real way, fashion undermined military readiness. Perhaps most fascinating is how shoes reinforced the stratified layers of society. Nobility wore the longest, most exaggerated points, sometimes half a meter long, signaling wealth and leisure. Merchants and craftsmen wore shorter versions, signaling aspiration. Peasants and laborers wore the simplest shoes, often with only the faintest nod toward points, if at all. This hierarchy was not subtle. Shoes were visible everywhere, in markets, in churches, in city streets. They became markers of identity, a form of social shorthand. You could know a man's class before he spoke a word, simply by glancing at his toes. It was precisely because of this visibility that authorities tried to legislate footwear. Laws restricting point length were less about health and more about preventing lower classes from appearing above their station. There was another hidden cost: hygiene. Medieval streets were cesspools of waste, animal dung, human refuse, and rotting food. Shoes, especially the long-pointed poulains, acted like shovels, dragging through filth. The soft leather absorbed moisture and bacteria, spreading infections and contributing to conditions like trench foot or festering wounds for those already struggling with bunions or deformities. A cut or sore on the foot could quickly turn septic. With limited medical care, something as small as a blister could lead to fever, disability, or death. In this way, shoes were not only instruments of pain, but also vehicles of disease. By the end of the 15th century, practicality began to claw its way back. Broad-toed shoes, known as duckbills or bear's paw shoes, came into fashion, marking the decline of the poulain craze. Ironically, this new style swung in the opposite direction. Shoes became absurdly wide rather than long, but at least they allowed feet more breathing room. Still, the economic and social lessons lingered. Poulains had proven that something as small as a shoe could shape economies, influence armies, and mark social boundaries as clearly as a crown or a sword. And yet, the story feels incomplete, because if shoes could become such visible markers of wealth, power, and identity, if they could cripple bodies and shape economies, then the question remains, what did it feel like to live your entire life inside them? Not just to wear them for a day or a year, but to grow up watching your elders hobble, to slip into narrow shoes at childhood, and to know that pain was as much a part of fashion as leather itself. If you were to line up a row of medieval shoes beside modern ones, at first glance, the differences might seem vast. Today's sneakers are built with cushioning, arch support, and synthetic fabrics. Boots are designed for hiking, running, or protection. By comparison, the soft, leather turnshoes and absurdly pointed poulains of the Middle Ages look almost like toys. And yet, if you look closer, the story they tell is uncomfortably familiar. Because, in truth, our relationship with footwear has not changed nearly as much as we'd like to imagine. When archaeologists in Cambridge unearthed those skeletons with bunions, twisted bones, bent by pointed shoes, they were not just studying the past, they were holding up a mirror. Consider the high heels of today. Consider shoes that pinch toes for the sake of elegance, or sneakers that cost fortunes, not for comfort, but for status. The medieval poulain craze is not an isolated curiosity. It is part of a long chain of choices where people willingly sacrificed health for appearance. In this sense, Europe's bunion-ridden feet whisper a truth across the centuries, that we are often willing to hurt ourselves in order to be seen. Taught shoes carry memory. In medieval Europe, they were so strongly tied to morality and class that they became metaphors in sermons, laws, and songs. Even centuries later, the image of the foolish pointed shoe lived on in art and folklore. Plays and poems mocked those who had once worn them, just as later generations would mock powdered wigs or corsets. But the very act of remembering them shows how deeply they had marked society. Fashion fades, but the ridicule of old fashions lingers, a reminder that each age is convinced of its own rationality, only to be laughed at by those who come after. What makes shoes fascinating is that they are so ordinary, so forgettable. No chronicler in the 14th century thought to dedicate a grand history to kings, wars, treaties. These filled the parchment. But shoes? Shoes were too humble to mention, and yet shoes outlasted parchment. Buried in graves, they survived as impressions on bone, as scraps of leather in the soil, as skeletal feet twisted by fashion's demands. In a way, They tell a more intimate story than any chronicle ever could, the story of daily life, of small decisions repeated millions of times until they reshaped bodies and cultures. It is tempting to smile at the folly of medieval fashion, at nobles hobbling along with half-meter-long points. But pause for a moment. Think of the high-heeled stiletto that reshapes posture and arches. Think of the narrow dress shoe that crushes toes for the sake of formality. Think of the endless churn of sneaker releases, purchased not for walking but for display. The medieval world, in its poulins, was not backward. It was simply human. It was us. The lesson beneath our feet is not that they were foolish and we are wise. It is that we are cut from the same cloth, or, perhaps more accurately, stitched into the same leather. For centuries after the decline of the poulain, Europe's shoe fashions swung like a pendulum, wide then narrow, practical then absurd. Each era left its mark on the human body. Each left behind skeletons and shoes for archaeologists to ponder. Shoes are, in many ways, the great unsung shapers of history. They determined how armies marched, how workers toiled, how diseases spread, and how status was signaled. They are the quiet infrastructure of human movement, as vital as roads, as telling as architecture. Yet often overlooked, the people of medieval Europe may not have realized it, but every step they took was shaped, quite literally, by the leather encasing their feet. So when you picture those long medieval streets, with nobles striding in pointed shoes and peasants trudging behind in patched leather, do not think only of discomfort. Think of the resilience of people who lived entire lives in such conditions. Think of how something as simple as a shoe could shape economies, deform bodies, and even whisper lessons across centuries. And then ask yourself, what are the shoes you wear saying about your place in history? Imagine a medieval kitchen, the hearth smoldering with yesterday's embers, the air thick with smoke, and pots blackened from endless use. In a corner stands a barrel of lye water, caustic enough to sting bare skin. Next to it rests a bucket of animal fat, congealed and sour. It is here, in such humble and unpleasant corners, that one of humanity's quiet revolutions took shape, the making of soap to modern ears. Soap feels ordinary, almost invisible. But in the Middle Ages, cleanliness was neither guaranteed nor simple. Bathhouses did exist, especially in larger towns, and public bathing was common before fears of disease and immorality shut many of them down. Still, soap itself was far from the neat white bars stacked on supermarket shelves today. For most people, washing meant water, sand, or even herbs rubbed against the skin. Clothes were scrubbed in rivers or pounded against stones. Soap, when it appeared, was an alchemical marvel, a mixture of ashes, fat, and patience. The recipe was deceptively simple: lye, made from water, filtered through wood, usually from slaughtered animals, pig, sheep, or cow, heat and time, to bind them together. The process, however, was anything but straightforward. The balance had to be exact. Too much lye, and the soap burned skin. Too little, and the mixture became a greasy paste. In a sense, soap was born from the marriage of fire and death, ash from burned wood, fat from slaughtered beasts. The result was often dark, crumbly, and harsh, but it worked. It cut through grease, lifted dirt, and left a faint, bitter smell. Not everyone had access to soap. The better versions, made with olive oil in the Mediterranean, were prized luxuries. Cities like Marseille in France and Castile in Spain became centers of fine soap production. Castile soap, made from pure olive oil and lye, was gentler, cleaner, and far more expensive than the rough tallow soap used by common folk. Owning such soap was a mark of wealth. In noble households, it was used not just for washing, but for laundering fine linen and preparing skin before religious ceremonies. A block of Castile soap could travel hundreds of miles along trade routes, as prized as spices or silk. By the 12th and 13th centuries, soap making had grown into an organized craft. Guilds emerged in cities, controlling recipes, regulating quality, and guarding secrets jealously. A soapmaker's workshop was part chemistry lab, part kitchen, and part fire hazard. Large cauldrons bubbled with fat and ash, filling streets with a sour-sweet stench that neighbors no doubt despised. These guilds were powerful because soap was indispensable. Soldiers needed it to wash bandages. Laundresses needed it for endless baskets of linen. Monks needed it to scrub their stone cloisters. The guilds became gatekeepers of cleanliness, and with that, of health. But as always in the medieval world, morality hovered nearby. Some theologians argued that excessive bathing, often paired with the sensual atmosphere of bathhouses, led to sin. In times of plague, suspicion turned darker. Could shared soap or water spread disease? As bathhouses closed, soap's role shifted more toward laundering and household cleaning, leaving bodies to endure dirt more stoically. And yet, in quieter corners, the humble practice of soap-making continued. Mothers stirred cauldrons with animal fat. Farmers set aside ashes from winter fires. It was messy, smelly work, but it kept families clean enough to survive in a dirty world. So picture a woman in a medieval village, stirring a bubbling pot of fat and ash. She is not thinking of chemistry or industry. She is thinking of her children's clothes, of the dirt on her husband's hands, of the stains of daily life. And in doing so, she is unknowingly preserving one of history's simplest but most vital crafts. But here lies the question: how did this humble, foul-smelling mixture grow into an international trade that linked villages to empires? If Section 1 was about survival, soap, as a household necessity forged from ashes and fat, Section 2 reveals a different truth. Soap was also money, power, and prestige. What began in smoky kitchens became a commodity traded across kingdoms, tied to empires and royal courts. By the 12th century, certain European cities had distinguished themselves as soap capitals. Among the most famous, Marseille, France, known for large-scale soap cauldrons and Mediterranean olive oil. Castile, Spain, producing pale, fine olive oil soap, prized across Europe. Naples and Venice, Italy, blending trade wealth with soap-making expertise. What these cities had in common was access to both raw materials and trade routes. Olive groves provided oil, while ports ensured that finished soap could travel quickly. Soap, though humble, became an early luxury good. Imagine a block of Castile soap in the 14th century, born in a cauldron in Toledo, molded into a pale brick. It began a journey northward. Packed in wooden crates, it traveled by mule to the coast, then by ship through the stormy Bay of Biscay, and finally into markets in England, Flanders, or Germany. By the time it reached London, the price had multiplied. A merchant might sell it to wealthy households or apothecaries, who cut it into smaller pieces for resale. To own Castile soap was to own a fragment of the Mediterranean, a whisper of warmth and light carried into cold northern lands. Royal households were among the biggest soap patrons. Records from the English crown in the 14th century detail purchases of imported soap for laundering fine linens and preparing the skin of nobles. To a nobleman, soap was not merely for scrubbing. It was part of ceremony. Clothes had to gleam at court. Hands had to be free of grime when signing treaties. Queens used soaps perfumed with herbs or oils to soften skin, a luxury unattainable for most peasants in this sense. Soap became another dividing line, one more marker separating the elite from the ordinary. As soap-making expanded, guilds grew fiercer in guarding recipes. In Marseille, for example, soap-makers were required by law to use only pure olive oil. Fraudulent soap, cut with animal fats or adulterated with fillers, could result in heavy fines. The secrecy was understandable. A good recipe was worth fortunes. A soap-maker who discovered the right balance of lye and oil could corner markets. This competition gave rise to regional identities: Marseille soap, Castile soap, Venetian soap. Even today, some of those names linger. The Church's relationship with soap was complicated. On one hand, monasteries produced their own for washing linens, treating wounds, and cleaning sacred vessels. Soap was part of the daily routine in cloisters, where hygiene mattered for health and spiritual order. On the other hand, church leaders were wary of excessive bathing. Too much attention to the body smacked of vanity or even lust. Sermons warned against indulgent baths scented with perfumed soaps. Yet, despite warnings, soap never disappeared from monasteries or noble households. Instead, it adapted, shifting toward laundering and practical use. By the 15th century, the soap industry was booming. In some towns, soap was so important that authorities taxed it directly. Soap makers became wealthy enough to wield influence, financing civic projects or sponsoring churches in port cities like Venice. Soap production dovetailed with global trade. Olive oil flowed in from the Levant, ashes came from northern Europe, and the finished product sailed outward again. Soap connected peasants burning wood in forests, farmers tending olives, merchants shipping goods, and nobles washing silks. It was, in its own way, one of the first truly globalized products, and yet, despite its spread, soap was not evenly available. Villagers still often made their own crude versions. Townsfolk might afford better quality, but only in small amounts. True luxury soaps remained the domain of the wealthy. The irony is striking. An invention so simple, made of fat and ash, could divide society as sharply as jewels or land. So soap was no longer just survival. It was trade, economy, even politics. But this raises a new question. What happened when soap's power collided with fear? When plague and superstition turned cleanliness into a matter of life, death, and suspicion? Picture a medieval city at the height of plague. The bells toll daily for the dead. Smoke rises from pyres. Doctors in long-beaked masks wander streets, clutching herbs. In such a world, soap should have been salvation, but instead it became wrapped in suspicion, fear, and paradox. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, cleanliness seemed more important than ever. Yet, in a cruel twist of misunderstanding, physicians often advised against bathing. They believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing plague vapors to seep into the body. Bathhouses, once places of communal washing, closed their doors. Public bathing was condemned not only for fears of sin, but also as a suspected cause of disease. Soap, which had once been linked with washing the body, shifted further toward laundering clothes and linens. Instead, it was a tragic irony. The very tools that could have reduced infection were sidelined by fear. Still, soap did not vanish. In monasteries, it was used to scrub sacred vessels or wash priests before Mass. The act of cleansing became symbolic as much as practical. Cleanliness represented purity, both physical and spiritual, for ordinary folk. Soap sometimes carried almost mystical significance. Some believed washing clothes with strong lye soap could ward off disease, as though the harshness of the mixture had protective powers. Others treated soap like medicine, rubbing it on sores or wounds in hopes of healing. It was crude, but it reveals how deeply people wanted to believe in the curative power of this strange mixture of ash and fat. As public baths fell out of favor, laundresses rose in importance. These women, often at the margins of society, scrubbed linens in rivers and tubs with harsh soaps. Their work was backbreaking, their hands raw from lye, and yet they became essential. Clean linen was seen as a marker of respectability, even when bodies went unwashed. Soap thus shaped not only health but also social identity. A person in dirty clothes risked ridicule. A noble in spotless linen signaled wealth and order. Soap had, in a sense, migrated from skin to fabric, from body to symbol. It would take centuries for the tide to turn back toward bathing. By the 16th and 17th centuries, physicians slowly began to reconsider. Cities like Paris reopened bath. Soap, especially imported Castile soap, grew in popularity among elites. In England, Queen Elizabeth I famously bathed once a month whether she needed it or not, a remark that both amuses and horrifies modern readers. Still, the groundwork was being laid. The very existence of soap-making guilds, trade routes, and recipes ensured that soap survived even in periods of fear. By the dawn of the modern era, it would emerge not as a luxury, but as a necessity. If you look back now, the history of medieval soap is less about the mechanics of cleanliness and more about the psychology of survival. People lived in filth, yet clung to small rituals of scrubbing, laundering, and purifying. Soap did not end plagues, but it left behind habits. It trained people to think of washing, to value cleanliness, to associate purity with health. Those small, boring habits laid the groundwork for revolutions in hygiene centuries later, revolutions that would save millions of lives. So the next time you pick up a smooth, perfumed bar of soap, remember its ancestry. Remember the village woman stirring fat and ash. Remember the Marseille merchant shipping olive oil bricks across the sea. Remember the laundress with raw hands at the riverbank. And above all, remember that history's survival often rests not in swords or kings, but in the small, quiet tools that touched ordinary lives. Soap was one such tool, forgotten by chronicles, but remembered by bones, linens, and the faint scent of ash that still lingers in its story. Walk along the ruins of an ancient Roman harbor, and you'll find something curious. The empire itself is long gone. Its armies vanished, its emperors dust, its cities reduced to fragments. Yet the concrete piers, poured more than 2,000 years ago, still stand stubbornly against the sea. Poured in our own time, often cracks within decades. Bridges crumble, highways split, and buildings require endless maintenance. Roman concrete, by contrast, seems almost alive, capable of healing itself. How did such a boring material become one of the greatest quiet legacies of an empire? The Roman recipe was simple on the surface: pozzolana, volcanic ash, named for the region of Posioli near Naples. Quicklime burned limestone water rubble, or stones for filler when combined. These elements formed a chemical marriage that modern scientists are still deciphering. The volcanic ash provided silica and alumina, which reacted with lime to create crystals that grew over time. Unlike modern concrete, which simply hardens and then begins to decay, Roman concrete improved with age. This was no accident. The Romans discovered, through trial and error, that volcanic ash, abundant in Italy, made their structures nearly eternal. Think of the Roman world not as marble and statues, but as concrete. The Colosseum, massive and enduring, is largely concrete beneath its stone veneer. The aqueducts that carried water across mountains were lined with it. The harbors that allowed ships to dominate the Mediterranean were poured with it. Concrete made Rome's expansion possible. Stone was slow to quarry and carve. Brick was fragile, but concrete could be mixed and poured anywhere. It was the empire's invisible weapon, allowing cities, forts, and ports to rise in record time. It is no exaggeration to say that the empire was glued together by mortar and ashdod, yet behind every monumental structure were ordinary laborers, men mixing ash and lime in wooden troughs, hauling buckets of wet slurry, tamping it into molds. Their work was not glamorous. It was backbreaking, repetitive, and, in many ways, invisible. But their labor outlived emperors. The names of those who mixed the mortar are forgotten, but their work remains, still standing in arches and seawalls. It is one of history's great ironies. The most durable achievements often came from the most ordinary hands. One of the greatest marvels of Roman concrete lies in its resistance to seawater. Modern ports crumble under constant assault by salt and waves. Roman harbors, however, have endured for millennia. The secret: a chemical reaction triggered by seawater itself. When waves seeped into the concrete, they did not weaken it. Instead, they encouraged the growth of crystals, rare minerals like stratlingite and aluminum tobermorite, which reinforced the structure. In effect, the concrete healed itself. Thus, what seemed a weakness was a strength. The Romans had unknowingly designed a material that grew stronger the more it was attacked, and yet this miraculous material was eventually forgotten. As the empire fell, so too did the organized knowledge of concrete making. Medieval builders returned to stone and brick. They could admire the Roman ruins towering above them, but they could not replicate them. The irony is striking. Entire centuries walked among indestructible walls without knowing how to make them. The recipe lingered in fragments of texts, but the alchemy of ash and lime was lost. So here lies the mystery. If Roman concrete was so durable, why did the knowledge vanish? And more intriguingly, how did its absence shape the centuries that followed? Centuries of crumbling castles and endless repairs. Imagine a mason in 12th century Europe standing before the ruins of a Roman aqueduct. The massive arches rise above him, weathered but intact, carrying no water, yet still defying gravity centuries after their builders had vanished. The mason marvels, perhaps even prays, for surely only giants or gods could have raised such a thing. Then he returns to his quarry, to chip stone block by block, because the secret of Roman concrete has been lost. This is the paradox of the Middle Ages. Europe lived among Roman ruins, saw their endurance daily, yet could not replicate them. Concrete, the invisible glue of an empire, had slipped quietly from human memory. The fall of Rome was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling. As political authority crumbled, so too did infrastructure, trade routes, and knowledge networks. Volcanic ash, essential for the strongest concrete, was not easily available outside Italy. Without the empire's vast trade system, distant provinces could not access it. Texts describing construction survived, but often in fragments. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, wrote of pozzolana, lime, and water, but copying errors and fading Latin made his works cryptic to later readers. Guild traditions replaced centralized knowledge. Medieval builders relied on what could be passed down within families or monasteries, skills with stone and mortar, not with ash and chemistry. In short, the empire's collapse broke the chain of transmission. The recipe for eternal stone was forgotten, even as the eternal stones remained. Without Roman concrete, medieval Europe turned back to traditional methods. Stone blocks, quarried and chiseled, became the backbone of castles. Cathedrals and bridges, lime mortar, a weaker cousin of Roman concrete, bound them together. Timber, abundant in northern Europe, substituted where stone was scarce. The results were magnificent but fragile. Gothic cathedrals soared, but their walls cracked, requiring constant repair. Castles stood strong, yet not unyielding. Bridges often collapsed, needing replacement. The durability of Roman works made medieval achievements look both impressive and precarious by comparison. The loss of concrete was more than technological. It was economic and cultural. Time. Carving stone took months, sometimes years. Where Romans could pour and mold concrete, medieval builders needed endless man-hours of chiseling labor. Entire villages were pressed into service to quarry and haul stones. Building projects strained communities for generations. Durability, repairs became a way of life. Cathedrals needed endless maintenance. Roads crumbled more quickly. Harbors weakened the boring material. Rome had once used freely, had been more revolutionary than anyone realized, and without it, Europe moved slower. It is difficult to overstate how much Roman ruins shaped the medieval imagination. Travelers described aqueducts and colosseums as the works of giants. Chroniclers speculated about lost races or divine builders. The idea that ordinary men had poured a slurry of ash and lime seemed impossible. These ruins became teaching tools without teachers. They inspired admiration, but not imitation. And so, while medieval masons developed dazzling new techniques in stone, they lacked the silent advantage of Rome's concrete. consider water. Romans had poured concrete-lined aqueducts that carried clean water for miles. Medieval cities, by contrast, often relied on wells or wooden pipes. Without durable concrete, vast aqueduct systems were nearly impossible to maintain. The result was stagnant cities, vulnerable to disease. The absence of concrete shaped not only architecture, but also public health. The fall of a recipe meant the rise of thirst, filth, and plague. By the Renaissance, scholars began digging through Roman texts again. Architects like Alberti and Palladio studied ruins and manuscripts, experimenting with lime, mortar, and mixtures. Yet even then, the true secret of volcanic ash remained obscure. Builders produced strong mortar, but nothing that matched the self-healing magic of Roman concrete. It was not until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the development of Portland cement, that Europe regained a durable concrete. By then, Rome's secrets had been lost for more than a millennium. So here is the puzzle. Europe stood in the shadow of Roman concrete for 1,000 years. Did this loss slow history itself? Did the forgotten recipe hold back bridges, harbors, and public health for centuries? And perhaps the deeper question is this: if we could lose something as simple as a recipe for stone, what else might we be forgetting even now? Walk into a modern laboratory today, and you might see a scene strangely familiar to Roman builders: buckets of volcanic ash, slaked lime, and water being mixed together. Only now the workers wear lab coats, not tunics, and instead of pouring harbor walls, they are analyzing chemical bonds under microscopes. What they are rediscovering is that the Romans were not lucky, they were brilliant. Their concrete was not an accident of geology. It was the product of centuries of observation, testing, and practical genius. In the past few decades, scientists have studied Roman concrete in unprecedented detail. Using scanning electron microscopes, they have identified rare minerals, aluminum, tobermorite, and philipsite, formed when volcanic ash and lime met seawater. What astonished researchers was that these minerals did not weaken the concrete. Instead, they made it stronger. Cracks that formed in Roman concrete filled themselves with new crystals, binding the material tighter. Where modern concrete is brittle, Roman concrete was resilient. Where modern concrete dies, Roman concrete heals. This discovery could not come at a more pressing time. Modern concrete, based on Portland cement, is one of the most widely used materials on Earth and one of the most environmentally destructive. Producing it releases enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. It also decays quickly, demanding repairs and replacements. By contrast, Roman concrete was low-carbon, durable, and long-lasting. Structures poured 2,000 years ago still stand. Imagine if our bridges, highways, and dams lasted not for decades, but for centuries. The energy and resources saved would be immense. What was once boring and forgotten now looks like a blueprint for the future. There is another lesson in Roman concrete, not of chemistry, but of memory. The recipe was lost not because it was too complex, but because societies failed to preserve knowledge. It slipped away in a fog of collapse, trade disruption, and neglect. How many other simple, transformative practices have been lost to history? How many crafts once shaped lives in profound ways, only to vanish in the silence of forgotten workshops? The bones of forgotten shoemakers and the ashes of forgotten soapmakers whispered the same warning as Roman concrete. Human survival depends on remembering. Roman concrete was not glamorous. It was not golden or jeweled. It was gray, unremarkable, utilitarian. Yet it endured. That is perhaps the greatest metaphor it offers. Civilizations do not survive through splendor alone, but through their ordinary, durable choices. The amphitheater was more than an arena of blood. It was concrete poured with volcanic ash. The aqueduct was more than an arch. It was mortar binding stone across miles. The harbor was more than a port. It was ash and lime hardened against the sea. Rome's real empire was built in buckets today. Tourists photograph the Colosseum and marvel at aqueducts. But what they are really marveling at is chemistry. They are admiring the quiet persistence of a material designed to last longer than its makers. And perhaps that is the strangest part. While emperors claimed immortality through statues, coins, or conquest, the only immortality that truly survived was in the mortar beneath their feet. So, as you stand before a Roman ruin, ask yourself, what will remain of us 2,000 years from now? Our glass will shatter. Our steel will rust. Our concrete may crumble. But perhaps, if we learn from Rome's boring genius, some future traveler will walk among our ruins and marvel, not at kings or empires, but at the quiet endurance of stone. Imagine for a moment that you live in the year 1500. You are a merchant in Augsburg, trying to send word to a partner in Venice. There is no telephone, no telegraph, no email. There is only paper, ink, and the uncertain back of a horse. Your message, once sealed with wax, begins a journey that will take not minutes, but days, sometimes weeks, and always with risk. This was the world of the postal rider, an unsung figure who carried the lifeblood of kingdoms, information. He rode through storms, mud, forests, and bandit-haunted passes, clutching saddlebags filled with secrets, orders, and news. To us, it seems painfully slow. But in its time, it was the fastest thing alive. The idea of long-distance communication is ancient. Romans had their cursus publicus, a vast relay system of couriers and stations. But after the empire's collapse, Europe fragmented. Messages were again carried by footmen, monks, or occasional mounted messengers. Distances that Romans had once covered in days now took weeks. A letter might vanish in the chaos of local wars, or be delayed until the news inside it was already old. In this fractured landscape, the arrival of organized postal riders was nothing short of revolutionary. The real breakthrough came with the Thurn Undi Taxis family, originally from northern Italy. In the late 15th century, they secured contracts with the Holy Roman Empire to establish a system of mounted couriers stretching across Europe. Stations were placed at regular intervals, where a rider could rest, exchange horses, and continue. Letters now moved with a speed unimaginable only decades before. From Brussels to Vienna, messages that once took weeks could now travel in days. Still, it was no effortless journey. Riders braved swollen rivers, broken roads, and constant danger from thieves. Their speed was impressive only by medieval standards. 30 or 40 miles in a day, if luck was kind. Who was the postal rider? Rarely noble, never rich. He was often a young man of sturdy build, used to hardship. His horse was his companion, his saddlebag, his livelihood. The pay was poor, the work endless, but there was honor in it. He carried messages that kings depended upon. Imagine him riding through rain at dusk, cloak heavy with water, lantern bobbing faintly. In his bags he carries orders for an army, contracts for merchants, perhaps even a love letter sealed in wax. Each scrap of parchment holds the fate of someone who waits and worries in another city, and all of it rests on the endurance of one horse. One man and a narrow road stretching into darkness. Postal riders depended on roads that were often little more than dirt tracks. In summer, dust choked the air. In winter, mud swallowed hooves. Bridges collapsed, bandits prowled. In mountain passes, avalanches blocked paths for weeks. This fragility meant that even the best organized postal system was at the mercy of weather and terrain. A message might arrive on time, or it might vanish forever in the saddlebag of a rider who never reached his destination. To us, waiting a week for news feels unbearable. But in the 16th century, a week's journey for a letter was a marvel. It was the difference between merchants making profits or losses, kings winning or losing battles. Time, in the age of postal riders, was not measured in minutes, but in days and distances. And the speed of a horse was the very limit of human communication. So when we think of postal riders galloping through the dark, saddlebags full of secrets, the question lingers. What did it mean to live in a world where knowledge itself moved so slowly, where entire kingdoms were built on the pace of a horse's hooves? By the early 16th century, the postal rider was no longer just a lonely figure on a road. He was part of a system, a living network of horses, stations, and men that bound Europe together with invisible threads of ink and parchment. And in a continent fractured by kingdoms and wars, that network was nothing short of revolutionary. The Thurn und Taxis family, entrusted with imperial postal rights, expanded routes across the Holy Roman Empire. From Brussels to Vienna, from Innsbruck to Rome, their riders galloped in relays. Stations were built every 20 to 30 miles, stocked with fresh horses and men ready to take the saddle. For the first time in centuries, communication had a rhythm. Letters could be timed, routes mapped, deliveries expected. What Rome had once achieved with its cursus publicus, Europe now reclaimed in a new form, the horse-borne relay. The first beneficiaries were merchants. In the age of slow ships and risky caravans, knowing prices even a few days earlier than arrival meant fortunes gained or lost. A letter carried from Antwerp to Venice could decide whether a trader bought wool, spices, or silk. Thus, the postal rider was not just a courier. He was the bloodstream of the economy. Behind every galloping horse was a ripple of coin, contracts, and wagers. Speed was money, and merchants paid dearly for it. Rulers quickly realized the power of a private postal network. A king who controlled the riders controlled information, orders to armies, reports from spies, and diplomatic messages all depended on them. The Habsburgs, in particular, wielded the Thurn und Taxis system as a political weapon. By monopolizing postal routes, they ensured that their rivals received news slower, while imperial commands moved swifter. Information became as decisive as gunpowder, but with power came suspicion. Letters were easily intercepted. Postal masters, bound to rulers, often opened messages, copied them, and resealed them. Spies lurked in post stations, bribing riders or clerks. What seemed a simple system of horses and bags became a world of espionage and secrecy. States scrambled to invent codes and ciphers, knowing that their letters might not reach their destinations unopened. In this sense, the postal rider was both messenger and potential betrayer. His saddlebag, a treasure chest of secrets that could topple governments. Yet, for the rider himself, life changed little. He still rode through mud and snow, still risked bandits, still slept in barns and ate in taverns along the way. His wages remained low. His name was rarely recorded, but he was part of something larger now. The horse under him was one of thousands. The letter in his bag was one of millions. Together, these men formed the nervous system of Europe, unseen, uncelebrated, yet indispensable. Despite its expansion, the postal system remained fragile. Wars could sever routes overnight. Floods washed away bridges, snow buried passes. Riders disappeared, killed by bandits, or simply swallowed by bad weather. And still, letters moved. Slowly, imperfectly, but steadily, they stitched together courts, cities, and markets. The system was always limping, yet it never entirely stopped. Perhaps most fascinating was how slowness itself shaped politics. A king might receive news of a battle days late, forcing decisions made in ignorance. A merchant might act on outdated prices, risking ruin. Delay was not just inconvenience, it was a weapon. Those who controlled the riders controlled who lived in knowledge and who lived in ignorance. So, as riders thundered down muddy tracks, carrying letters for kings and merchants alike, one question lingered. What happened to the people caught in the gap between letters, those whose fates were decided while words still rattled in a saddlebag? Close your eyes and imagine the sound of Europe in the 16th century. Somewhere in the distance, you might hear the steady, rhythmic beat of hooves on a muddy road. That sound, the gallop of a postal rider, was the sound of connection. Every thud carried orders, hopes, secrets. But just as no horse can run forever, so too did the age of the postal rider reach its end. By the 17th century, rulers realized that private families like the Thurn und Taxis held too much power. Letters were knowledge, and knowledge meant control. Step by step, monarchies began to seize the postal system. France established the royal post, opening routes to serve both crown and subjects. England created the Royal Mail in 1516, later expanding into a system where even commoners could send letters across Europe. Postmasters, appointed by kings, replaced independent families, stamping royal authority onto every envelope. The sound of hoofbeats remained, but now they belonged to the crown. At the same time, another revolution was shaking Europe, the printing press. Suddenly, news could be multiplied by the hundreds, even thousands, and distributed far beyond what a single rider could carry. The rider still mattered, but now he carried not just letters, but bundles of printed gazettes. The slow trickle of information became a flood, and in that flood, the once lonely courier became part of something vaster. The birth of mass communication. With state control came both trust and intrusion. On the one hand, letters could now travel more reliably, supported by royal funding. On the other hand, every post office became a potential eye of the state. Kings opened letters, copied them, resealed them. Espionage became bureaucratic. The postal rider's world of hidden risks had not disappeared. It had simply moved indoors, to postmasters' desks lined with wax seals and secret knives. By the 18th century, the rider himself was fading. Coaches, pulled by teams of horses, could carry more letters at greater speed. Roads improved, bridges were rebuilt, and the lone galloping figure became less necessary. He was still there, in remote areas where coaches could not go. But in cities and along major routes, his role shrank. The age of hoofbeats was giving way to the rumble of wheels. The true death of the postal rider came in the 19th century, when railways spread across Europe. A train could carry more letters in a single car than riders could in weeks. The speed was overwhelming. Messages that once took days now arrived in hours. For the rider, it was the end of a profession. For Europe, it was the birth of a new rhythm, the modern pace of communication. And yet, the postal rider should not be forgotten. He was the bridge between worlds, between monks walking letters across forests and machines hurtling mail by rail. His endurance, his hardship, his lonely gallop kept Europe connected in a time when connection was fragile. Every stamped letter today, every email, every instant message rests on the back of that rider. He carried not just parchment, but the very idea that communication should not stop, no matter the weather, the war, or the risk. So the next time you hear the sound of hooves, perhaps only in your imagination, remember that for centuries, this was the fastest sound on earth. It was the heartbeat of empires, the drum of trade, the whisper of lovers across distance. And perhaps ask yourself, when speed is no longer measured in hooves, but in milliseconds, have we lost something of the patience, the weight, the meaning that once clung to every letter carried in a saddlebag? When you picture a medieval castle, perhaps you think of soaring towers, banners flapping in the wind, knights pacing stone halls. What you probably don't imagine is the smell. Yet every grand fortress, no matter how noble, had to answer the same unglamorous question: where did everyone go to the toilet? The answer was neither elegant nor uniform. From wooden seats perched over streams to narrow shafts built into thick stone walls, medieval toilets, known as privies or garderobes, were inventions of necessity. And though they seem crude by modern standards, they were feats of engineering in their own quiet way. The most iconic medieval toilet was the garderobe, a small room jutting out from a castle wall. A simple stone or wooden seat was set over a vertical shaft. Waste dropped straight down, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes into the moat, and occasionally just down the wall itself. If a garderobe projected over running water, the flow carried waste away. But more often, it collected below, creating a foul-smelling pit that had to be shoveled out periodically by the least fortunate workers in the castle. It was not pretty, but it worked. There was, however, a problem. Garderobes could become weak points in castle defenses. Attackers sometimes exploited waste shafts as entry routes. Chronicles record sieges where soldiers crept up garderobe chutes to infiltrate fortresses. For this reason, some castles built iron grates beneath their toilets to prevent unwelcome visitors from arriving the wrong way. Imagine the indignity. Your mighty fortress, breached not by battering rams or siege towers, but by a soldier climbing through the latrine for castle residence. The smell of garderobes was a constant companion. Ventilation was poor, and waste pits built up quickly. Servants sometimes threw herbs or rushes down the shafts to mask odors. In wealthier castles, multiple garderobes were installed to spread the burden. But even in noble halls, the stench was unavoidable. The grandeur of banquets upstairs coexisted with the reality of cesspits below. Medieval life was always closer to filth than modern imaginations like to admit. Curiously, garderobes also doubled as storage. Clothes, especially expensive woolens and furs, were sometimes hung in garderobe chambers. The strong ammonia smell of waste repelled moths and vermin. In a strange twist, the medieval toilet became both a source of stench and a protector of garments. It is from this practice that the word wardrobe, originally garderobe, evolved. Today it means a place for clothes. In the Middle Ages, it meant the place where clothes were hung in the latrine's fumes. It's easy to forget that castles, for all their grandeur, were lived in spaces. Lords, ladies, servants, and soldiers all shared the same human needs. Garderobes reminded everyone that beneath the titles and armor, all bodies worked the same way, and though castles stood as symbols of power, they were also, in their own way, vast plumbing problems. So as you picture the walls of a medieval castle, strong against arrows and fire, imagine instead the small wooden seat above a shaft of waste. Ask yourself, how did these daily, unglamorous realities shape life inside the very symbols of power? If garderobes were the visible solution, cesspits were the hidden reality. Beneath the floors of castles, monasteries, and entire towns lay pits dug into the earth, sometimes lined with stone or brick, where waste collected in silence. These pits were rarely mentioned in chronicles or poems, but they were as essential as walls and gates. For without them, life in the Middle Ages would have been unbearable. A cesspit was essentially a hole in the ground, but it had layers of design. Builders often lined the sides with stone to prevent collapse. Some were built with porous bottoms, allowing liquid waste to slowly seep into the soil. Others were sealed, requiring periodic emptying. In towns, cesspits often sat directly beneath homes or courtyards. In castles, they lurked beneath garderobe shafts. Over time, they filled, becoming heavy, foul reservoirs of waste. And when they filled too high, someone had to empty them. Enter the gong farmer, one of the most unpleasant jobs in all of history. The word gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go. Gong farmers were the men hired to shovel out cesspits when they became too full. They worked at night, under cover of darkness, hauling waste in buckets. The stench was overwhelming. So too was the danger. Methane built up in pits, suffocating or even igniting with lanterns. Some gong farmers died in their work, their names forgotten in the muck for their troubles. They were well paid, sometimes earning more than common laborers, but they were despised. Laws forbade gong farmers from appearing in public during the day, their very presence considered offensive. Still, without them, cities and castles would have drowned in filth. Towns presented special challenges. Streets often doubled as sewers. Chamber pots were emptied from windows, their contents splattering into alleys. Regulations attempted to control this habit, but enforcement was weak. The phrase, "mind your head," may owe its origin to the cries of warning before a pot was dumped. Cesspits, meanwhile, leaked. In London, records from the 14th century describe neighbors suing one another when waste seeped through walls. Some cesspits contaminated wells, spreading disease. The line between waste management and public health was thin, and it was frequently crossed. Inside castles, the reality was no different. Lords might sit on carved wooden garderobes, but someone still had to shovel out the pit below. Servants labored in silence, scraping muck and hauling it away. Their work was invisible, yet essential without it. Even the most splendid feast hall would soon reek in this sense. Castles were layered worlds, nobility above, laborers below, waste flowing downward in both a literal and symbolic hierarchy. Surprisingly, waste was not always useless. Gong farmers sometimes sold the contents of cesspits to farmers as fertilizer. The nitrogen-rich, muck-enriched fields, completing a strange cycle from castle table to cesspit to plowed soil. What nobles discarded, peasants transformed into sustenance. It was yet another reminder of how medieval survival depended on making use of everything. No matter how foul, so behind every grand banquet, every sermon in a cathedral, every royal proclamation, there was a cesspit slowly filling, and men with shovels waiting to empty it. The question lingers, how did this constant, hidden labor shape the rhythm of medieval life, and how much of history rests on the backs of those willing to endure filth? When we think of medieval toilets, it is easy to focus only on the mechanics, the garderobe chute, the cesspit, the gong farmer's bucket. But waste is never just physical, it is cultural. How people dealt with it reflected how they understood privacy, morality, and even their own humanity. In castles and cities alike, the toilet was both a practical tool and a quiet mirror of medieval society. Today, toilets are among the most private of spaces. For the medieval world, privacy was rare. In castles, garderobes were often small chambers off main halls, sometimes used by several people at once. In monasteries, communal latrines lined with stone seats allowed dozens of monks to relieve themselves side by side in silence. The idea of shutting a door and locking oneself away was foreign. Waste was seen as an unavoidable fact of life, less hidden than today. The garderobe might have a curtain at best. Silence, not solitude, was the mark of dignity. Still, shame existed, not in the act itself, but in who handled it. Lords and ladies relieved themselves in garderobes high above. Servants carried their chamber pots. Gong farmers emptied cesspits at night. The foulest labor always fell on the lowest ranks. This hierarchy reinforced itself daily. A noble could ignore the stench beneath his feet because someone else bore the burden. Waste became a symbol of class as much as of biology. A reminder that privilege meant distance from filth. To walk through a medieval town was to be surrounded by waste. Cesspits overflowed, chamber pots splashed into alleys, animals left dung in the streets. The smell was constant, inescapable, woven into the fabric of daily life. Chroniclers noted it, travelers complained of it, but no one expected escape. Smell defined cities as much as bells or markets. In this way, waste shaped memory. To recall a medieval city was to recall its stench. Though medieval people had no germ theory, they sensed that waste was dangerous. Laws forbade cesspits near wells. Some cities banned chamber pots from being emptied onto main streets. The link between filth and illness was poorly understood, but intuitively feared. Ironically, practices that seemed hygienic sometimes made things worse. Porous cesspits let liquids drain into soil, but also into water supplies. Bathhouses closed during plague out of fear of bad air, when in truth cleaner bodies and clothes might have slowed disease. Waste management was always a balance of effort, ignorance, and survival more than anything. Toilets symbolized the medieval struggle to live with contradictions. Castles were symbols of power, yet they reeked of human waste. Monasteries were centers of prayer, yet their latrines echoed with silence broken only by bodily sounds. Cities dreamed of order, yet they flowed with filth. The garderobe, humble and overlooked, was the truest emblem of medieval life. Practicality wrapped in stone, dignity jostling with stink. Survival built atop constant labor. So next time you picture a medieval castle, don't imagine only the banners, the knights, the feasts. Imagine also the garderobe jutting from the wall, the cesspit filling below, the gong farmer trudging with his bucket, for it was waste as much as war that defined daily existence. And ask yourself, if the way a society handles its filth reveals its values, what will our toilets someday say about us? Imagine tearing into a warm hunk of bread after a long day's labor in a medieval field. The crust is dark, the inside dense, and though it is coarse compared to the fine white loaves of the wealthy, it fills your belly. But hidden in that bread, lurking in the rye itself, is a fungus so small you cannot see it, and so powerful it can twist your body, your mind, and your community into chaos. This was ergot, a parasitic fungus that thrived in damp conditions and infected rye, one of the most common grains of northern Europe. To the naked eye, it appeared as blackened, hardened kernels, sometimes called ergot sclerotia, mixed among healthy rye. Ground into flour, baked into bread, it became invisible, and once consumed, it could unleash terrifying symptoms. The disease caused by eating contaminated bread became known as ergotism. Its symptoms came in two terrifying forms: convulsive ergotism. Victims suffered seizures, hallucinations, crawling sensations under the skin, and fits of madness. They screamed, convulsed, and sometimes accused one another of witchcraft or demonic possession. Gangrenous ergotism. Blood vessels constricted, cutting off circulation. Fingers and toes blackened, limbs rotted, and eventually fell away. The pain was excruciating, the stench unbearable. Villages sometimes awoke to find dozens of people afflicted, writhing in streets or moaning in bed. In places where rye bread was the staple food, entire communities lived under this hidden threat. Because for much of medieval northern Europe, rye was the grain of necessity. Wheat was reserved for the wealthy, white, soft, and expensive. Rye grew in harsher soils, in colder climates, and was affordable for peasants. But rye was also more vulnerable to damp weather. A wet summer could mean a harvest riddled with ergot. The poor could not afford to discard grain. They ground it, baked it, and ate it anyway. Bread that fed them also poisoned them. The cruel irony was unmistakable. The poor survived on rye, but rye sometimes destroyed them. The disease was so widespread that it earned a terrifying name: St. Anthony's fire. The burning sensations in limbs, the blackened flesh, the fevered visions, all were attributed to the fiery torment of the saint's curse. Hospitals dedicated to St. Anthony were founded to treat sufferers. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony became famous for caring for ergot victims, offering relief with diets that excluded rye. Patients who survived often credited the saint with miracles. In truth, it was simply the absence of poisoned bread. Convulsive ergotism, with its visions and delirium, could ripple through entire communities. People claimed to see demons, to hear voices, to feel insects crawling beneath their skin. Groups convulsed together in spasms. In later centuries, some historians even suggested that outbreaks of ergotism may have fueled episodes of mass hysteria, from medieval witch hunts to the infamous Salem witch trials in colonial America. For medieval villagers, there was no scientific explanation. Bread was life. If bread became torment, then surely God or the devil was at work. The most insidious part of ergotism was its invisibility. Unlike plague, which struck with buboes and death within days, ergot crept into life quietly. Bread looked normal. Families ate together. And then, one by one, symptoms appeared. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you stop eating the very bread that keeps you alive? These were the impossible dilemmas peasants faced in damp years when the harvest betrayed them. So when you picture a medieval table with its loaves of rye bread, ask yourself, how many of those meals were both nourishment and poison? Life and death bound together in a single crust. Picture a village in the Rhine Valley after a wet harvest. The rye is brought in damp, stored in barns that leak, and ground into flour before winter. Loaves are baked, handed out, eaten. Weeks later, the village is in chaos. Some people writhe in fits, clutching their limbs. Others cry of visions, claiming they see devils in the corners of the room. A child screams through the night, unable to stop convulsing. Fingers blacken. To the people living through it, it can only mean one thing: witchcraft. Historians believe outbreaks of ergotism sometimes fed into the witch craze that swept Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries. When whole families convulsed or claimed visions, communities looked for culprits. A widow, a healer, a stranger. Someone had to be blamed. The ergot itself, invisible and tasteless, once baked, offered no obvious culprit. But suspicion needed an answer. If bread, the very symbol of life, blessed in church, could turn to poison, then surely it must have been bewitched. Witch trials often drew on testimony of visions, hallucinations, or unexplained sickness, all symptoms eerily similar to convulsive ergotism. Mass hysteria is no new phenomenon. In Strasbourg in 1518, a dancing plague struck, where dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people danced uncontrollably for days. Some scholars suggest ergot poisoning could have played a role. Its convulsive spasms mistaken for frenzied movement. Imagine the sight: streets filled with writhing, twitching bodies, interpreted not as illness, but as divine punishment or diabolic possession. Bread, simple, daily bread, may have been the hidden trigger. Meanwhile, hospitals of the Order of St. Anthony filled with sufferers. Pilgrims traveled long distances to these monasteries, hoping for healing. The monks provided clean diets without rye, ointments for burns, and spiritual comfort. To peasants, these were miracles. To us, it is clear, removing ergot from their food supply brought relief. But the association with the Saint Lingard. To suffer ergotism was to feel the fire of Saint Anthony. To recover was to owe thanks to him. Thus, faith wrapped itself around fungus, giving suffering a name and a framework, even if the true cause remained unknown. Beyond the madness, ergotism carried quieter consequences. Outbreaks could cripple villages. Fields of rye, once harvested, became useless. Bread, the daily staple, was distrusted. Families starved rather than eat grain that might carry the curse. Trade faltered when rumors spread of infected grain. Merchants learned to test rye visually, sorting out the blackened kernels. But in poor years, few dared throw away food. Hunger left little choice but risk. In this way, damp weather could tip entire regions into cycles of famine, disease, and fear. Bread in medieval Europe was more than food. It was sacred. It was the body of Christ in the Eucharist, the measure of sustenance, the daily prayer for our daily bread. To see bread itself turn against you was a spiritual as well as physical catastrophe. When loaves carried poison, when holy bread brought convulsions, people felt abandoned by God, or worse, they felt attacked by the devil himself. So picture a village table. Loaves set out with care, prayers spoken over them, only for those who ate to fall into madness or rot. And ask, how many of the cries for witch burning, how many of the fears of devils, were in truth the whispers of a fungus hidden inside the crust? If the Middle Ages knew ergot only as curse and fire, later centuries began to see something stranger. That the very fungus which drove peasants into madness and rotted limbs in villages might also hold power to heal. What was once seen only as the devil's handiwork slowly revealed itself as one of nature's most complicated and dangerous gifts. By the 17th and 18th centuries, physicians began noticing a pattern. Outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire followed damp harvests, always in regions where rye was common. In France, Germany, and Russia, doctors documented symptoms and began to suspect a food-borne cause. It wasn't until the 19th century that science clearly identified the culprit: Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus. Under microscopes, those black kernels on rye heads revealed themselves as the tiny factories of poisons that had haunted Europe for centuries. What had once been explained as demons or divine wrath was now understood. Chemistry. Yet, ergot was not simply discarded as poison. Its compounds, when studied, proved to have powerful effects on the human body. Ergot alkaloids were found to constrict blood vessels, the very cause of gangrene in ergotism. But in controlled doses, those same compounds could stop postpartum bleeding by contracting the uterus, saving the lives of countless women. Later, ergot derivatives would be used in treatments for migraines, exploiting their vascular effects. The fungus that had once been feared became, paradoxically, a tool of medicine. Perhaps most famously, ergot contains chemicals related to lysergic acid, the foundation for LSD, the hallucinatory effects peasants once described, visions, sensations of insects crawling, voices in the air, were the same pathways explored centuries later in laboratories. Thus, the madness of medieval villages was not delusion in itself, but the byproduct of chemistry. The devil's whispers were molecules acting on the brain, even as science revealed the fungus. Ergot outbreaks did not vanish quickly. Into the 19th century, poor harvests in Russia and Eastern Europe still carried outbreaks of ergotism. The poor still risked eating contaminated bread rather than starving. Whole villages still bore the scars of famine and fungus. It was only with the rise of modern agriculture, seed cleaning, crop rotation, fungicides, that ergot retreated from daily life. But the memory lingered. For centuries, bad bread haunted European folklore, a shadow of hunger and fear passed from grandparents to grandchildren. What makes ergot's story most poignant is how it twisted the meaning of bread. Bread was life, bread was prayer, bread was survival. Yet, in certain seasons, bread was death. To sit at a table and eat a poisoned loaf was to lose trust in the very foundation of life. When science finally untangled the fungus, bread was restored to its place, not as a curse, but as nourishment. Yet the memory of St. Anthony's fire ensured that bread would never be taken for granted again. So when you slice into a loaf today, clean and safe, remember the centuries when each bite carried risk. Remember the peasants writhing in convulsions, the monks tending the sick, the courts accusing witches, the mothers burying children after a poisoned harvest. Ergot reminds us that history is not always shaped by kings or battles, but by the smallest, dullest details. The fungus on a grain, the unseen enemy in a loaf of bread. And ask yourself, how many other dangers lie hidden in our daily lives, waiting centuries to reveal their truth? Close your eyes and imagine the countryside of medieval Europe. No factories, no trains, no clock towers, yet only fields, woods, and villages. Time itself is not measured by minutes, but by the turning of seasons, by the church bells, by the growth of crops. For peasants, life was a calendar written in soil, sweat, and hunger. Every day was work, but the kind of work shifted with the seasons, each month bringing its own demands. For medieval peasants, survival was tied to cycles of nature. They rose with the sun, worked until dusk, and slept when dark fell. Yet their lives were not monotonous. Instead, they followed a rhythm as old as farming itself, plowing, planting, harvesting, storing, and enduring. Every task mattered. A missed planting, a failed harvest, a spoiled storehouse, any of these could mean starvation in winter. Time was not abstract. It was lived directly in the body, in hunger and in exhaustion. The year often began in hardship. Winter was a season of waiting, with little fresh food. Villagers relied on salted meat, dried beans, and grain from the previous harvest. But stores thinned quickly. The hungry gap, the late winter months, were dreaded. When bellies grew lean and disease struck weakened bodies, work in winter did not stop. Men repaired tools, mended fences, cut firewood. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and tended animals in barns. Children gathered kindling or scattered straw. Though fields lay quiet under frost, labor continued indoors. Winter was a season of preparation, of keeping alive. conserving and waiting for spring's thaw. As soon as frost loosened the soil, plowing began. Heavy wooden plows, pulled by oxen, carved furrows into the earth. Men followed with seed bags, casting grain by hand into rows. Women and children scattered dung as fertilizer, carried water, and chased birds away from fields. Spring was also lambing season, when sheep gave birth. Cows calved, chickens laid more eggs, and barns filled with the noise of new life. For peasants, this was a time of both hope and exhaustion. Long days, muddy boots, aching backs, but also the relief of green shoots breaking through earth. The church calendar intertwined with this work. Lent fell in spring, a season of fasting, not by choice, but by necessity. As stores ran out, peasants ate what they had: thin soups, coarse bread, sometimes little more than onions or peas. Spring also brought another reality: the arrival of the Lord's officials. Rents, often paid in grain or labor, were collected. A peasant might have to plow not only his own fields, but also those of his lord. The burden of work was doubled, and yet unavoidable. The cycle of labor was never entirely one's own. Even the turning of soil was shaped by obligations upward. By May, the landscape transformed. Fields grew green, trees blossomed, and festivals like May Day allowed rare moments of joy. Dancing around a maypole, feasting, or singing songs of fertility were brief respites before summer's grueling work began. But even these celebrations had their edge. They were prayers as much as parties. Rituals to coax good harvests from fickle soil. So when you imagine a medieval peasant's winter and spring, picture not idleness, but constant motion, chopping, plowing, sowing, praying, and ask, what must it have felt like to live in a world where every month, every task was tied so directly to whether your family would eat or starve?
Summer in medieval Europe was not leisure. It was a season when every able hand, from children to elders, bent to the fields. Long daylight meant long work days, the sun stretching labor into 14 hours or more. The margin between survival and starvation was measured in how well the summer was spent. June began with hay. Grass had to be cut, dried, and stacked to feed animals through the coming winter. Without hay, cows and oxen would starve, and the plow teams that turned the soil in spring would vanish with them. Men swung scythes across fields in wide arcs, the metal blades singing through tall grass. Women followed, turning the cut grass so it could dry evenly. Children gathered it into heaps. Rain could ruin the work in a day, rotting cut hay into useless mulch. Everyone labored quickly, praying for sun. The herrick rising in the field was more than a pile of fodder. It was security, a bank account in grass. By July, the fields of grain needed constant watching. Weeds were pulled, pests driven away, fences mended. Rabbits and birds were relentless thieves. Children spent long days clapping sticks or throwing stones to scare them off. It was dull work, but deadly serious. Each year of rye, or wheat was food, lose too much, and winter meant hunger. Meanwhile, gardens yielded peas, beans, onions, and herbs. Women tended these plots, the kitchen garden that flavored stews and kept families alive when grain ran short. Every hand-sized cabbage was a victory against famine. Then came the month of fire and sweat, the harvest. This was the climax of the peasant year, the point toward which every earlier task had bent. Men swung sickles and scythes, cutting down fields of rye, oats, and wheat. Women and children followed, bundling sheaves, stacking them in stooks to dry. Work began at dawn and often ended by moonlight. Harvest was exhausting, but it was also communal. Villages gathered together, families helping one another. Songs rose over fields, both to keep rhythm and to lighten endless days. Feasts sometimes followed successful harvests, bread and ale shared in gratitude, a brief lifting of burdens. But always, the shadow of obligation lingered. Much of the harvest belonged not to the peasant, but to the Lord. Tithes to the church, rents to landlords, and dues to officials consumed a significant portion. Peasants stored what was left, knowing it had to last until next year. Summer was relentless. Hands blistered from scythes, backs bent from stooping. The sun cracked lips and burned skin. Women rose before dawn to milk cows, labored in the fields all day, then returned to prepare meals and care for children. Children themselves, from the age of 5 or 6, joined the labor force. There was no such thing as childhood in the modern sense, only smaller workers with lighter tools. Yet even in the grind, moments of joy existed. Festivals like Lammas, Loaf Mass, on August 1st celebrated the first loaves baked from new grain. Villages gathered to share bread, blessing the harvest. These rituals bound communities together, turning survival into celebration. Songs, prayers, laughter in the fields. These were as much tools of survival as sickles and scythes. They reminded peasants that work, though endless, was shared. So imagine the rhythm of summer. Scythes cutting hay, children chasing crows, women binding sheaves, men hauling cartloads of grain. Every day blistering, every hour spoken for. And ask yourself, what did it mean to live in a world where even joy was measured in how much the fields yielded? The fields are bare now. The golden sheaves of summer have been carried to barns. The songs of harvest faded. Autumn in the medieval village was not rest. It was reckoning. It was a season when a year's labor was measured, debts were paid, and survival was weighed against the cold months to come. Once the harvest was gathered, it was threshed. Men wielded flails, beating grain from stalks on barn floors. The air filled with dust, the sound of wood striking straw echoing through villages. This was when reality set in. After tithes to the church, rents to the Lord, and grain set aside for next year's seed, what remained had to feed families until the next harvest. For many peasants, the margin was razor thin. It was a moment of anxiety. Bins filled or remained pitifully low. The future hung in those heaps of rye and oats. October was the time of the second harvest. Apples gathered, grapes pressed into wine, nuts shaken from trees. Pigs were fattened on fallen acorns in forests. Women preserved what they could, drying herbs, smoking meat, salting fish. It was a season of abundance, yet also of urgency. Winter loomed, and every apple stored, every salted herring packed, was another day bought against hunger. In villages, harvest festivals marked this moment. Ale flowed, bread was shared, and for a few nights, relief took the place of toil. But beneath the celebration was sober knowledge. Soon the days would shorten, the ground freeze, and feasts give way to famine. November brought the annual slaughter. Animals that could not be fed through winter were killed. Smokehouses filled with the scent of curing meat, blood sausages, salted hams, and jars of lard-lined storerooms. For peasants, this was practical necessity. Hay was limited, grain scarce. Better to preserve meat now than to watch animals starve later. The work was grim, but communal. Families gathered to butcher, salt, and hang cuts of pork and beef. Children carried buckets, women rendered fat, men swung cleavers. Life and death mixed in every task. By December, the year slowed. Snow lay on fields, and labor shifted indoors. Spinning wheels turned, leather was mended, tools sharpened. Fires burned low, fueled by carefully rationed wood. Christmas offered rare respite, a holy day, a feast, a moment of warmth. But for most peasants, joy was tempered by hunger and cold. The year of labor had closed, but another loomed, waiting in spring. The peasant's year was not a story with an ending. It was a circle. Each January began where the last December left off. Hungry, cold, preparing for survival. There was no escape, no retirement, only the rhythm of seasons repeating until death. And yet, within that cycle lay resilience. The songs sung at harvest, the prayers whispered at sowing, the laughter shared on holy days. These gave meaning to lives measured in toil. So when you picture medieval peasants, Do not imagine only their bent backs or rough hands. Imagine their calendars, not written on parchment but carved into memory, etched into hunger and relief, labor and rest. Their lives remind us of truth both dull and profound. History is not built only by kings and knights, but by men and women who rose each day to meet the seasons. Their labor turned soil into bread, grass into milk, animals into strength. Without them, castles would have crumbled, lords gone hungry, and kingdoms starved. And perhaps ask yourself, if our lives were tied so closely to the turning of the seasons, what would we notice that we no longer see today? Step outside on a winter's evening in medieval Europe. The sun has set, and the world is swallowed in darkness. There are no street lamps, no glow of cities on the horizon, no electric bulbs buzzing in homes. The only light comes from fire, hearths, torches, and candles. To live then was to live in a world where night was total. Darkness was not an inconvenience. It was a natural state of existence. For peasants and townsfolk alike, candles were not luxuries of mood or decoration. They were survival. A candle meant the difference between finishing a task after sunset and stumbling blindly. It meant reading prayers in a psalter, writing a ledger, or stitching cloth through the long nights of winter. But light was fragile. A gust of wind snuffed it. A careless elbow toppled it. Wax was scarce, tallow greasy and smoky. Every flame was fleeting, borrowed from darkness rather than banishing it. The medieval candle came in two main forms. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, cheap, foul-smelling, and smoky. They sputtered, dripped, and filled rooms with a greasy odor. For peasants, they were the only affordable option. Beeswax candles burned clean and bright with a pleasant scent, but they were expensive, reserved for churches, monasteries, and the wealthy. A single beeswax candle might cost a day's wages. Thus, light itself was stratified by class. The poor lived in smoke and stink, the rich in golden glow. Because they were so valuable, candles often functioned as currency. Peasants sometimes paid rents or dues in candles. Guilds gave candles as offerings. Wills left candles to churches to burn for the souls of the dead. To give light was to give life, remembrance, or honor. In this way, the candle became more than an object. It was a symbol of devotion, obligation, and memory. In monasteries, candles structured entire lives. Monks rose at midnight to chant prayers by flickering wax. Scriptoria, the writing rooms where manuscripts were copied, glowed with steady flames as monks bent over pages deep into the night. The candle was not merely utility. It was the breath of faith. But even here, light was costly. Monasteries carefully recorded how many candles were burned, how much wax collected, how many hives tended. To copy knowledge was to consume light, hour by hour, flame by flame. Outside of churches and castles, darkness ruled. Streets were perilous after sundown. Travelers risked robbers, wolves, or worse. Superstitions flourished in the night. Demons, ghosts, and witches were said to thrive where no flame reached. The candle, small and flickering, was a defense against fear as much as against blindness. In the Middle Ages, to light a candle was to push back not only darkness but the unknown. So picture a single tallow candle burning in a peasant's cottage, smoky, short-lived, and precious. Every flicker is a calculation. Should it burn longer or should it be saved? And ask, what did it mean to live in a world where every moment of light had to be earned, bought, or prayed for? If darkness was a natural state of medieval life, then light had to be manufactured, and that meant labor, trade, and profit. Candles were not merely objects. They were a commodity, a currency, and a business that tied together peasants, guilds, churches, and kings. At the root of the candle economy was the bee. Beeswax candles were the gold standard of light, clean, bright, and long-burning. But beeswax came only from the careful tending of hives. Beekeepers were not always wealthy, but they wielded influence. Monasteries in particular kept extensive apiaries, harvesting honey for food and wax for candles. Entire estates measured their prosperity not just in acres of grain, but in the hives that produced light for winter and worship. Wax was so valuable that it was sometimes collected as tax or rent. A peasant family might owe their lord not just grain, but a set number of candles each year. To fail meant debt, or worse. Where beeswax was gold, tallow was copper. Cheap, abundant, but foul, rendered from animal fat. Tallow candles were smoky and smelly, leaving greasy stains on walls. But they were the only option for most households. Butchers often supplied the fat, while women in villages made candles at home. Dipping wicks into melted tallow again and again, they built up thin layers of greasy light. It was tedious, messy work, but without it, nights would be darker still. In towns and cities, candle production was controlled by guilds. Chandlers, candle makers, formed powerful associations, regulating quality, setting prices, and dividing the market between wax and tallow. The guild system ensured that candles remained expensive,